The winter wind carried more than snow through the streets of Boston that Christmas Eve. It carried the weight of 3 years of grief, the burden of carefully constructed walls, and the whisper of possibility that Dominic Reeves had tried desperately to ignore. He stood outside Pine Grove Bistro, his work boots leaving prints in fresh powder, his flannel shirt beneath a worn leather jacket, marking him as someone who worked with his hands, rather than spreadsheets. At 38, he had the weathered look of a man who had rebuilt his life from ashes, his dark hair touched with premature silver, his green eyes holding stories he rarely shared. Asterisk, if you believe that true wealth lies not in bank accounts, but in human connection. Stay until the end of this remarkable story. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because what happens next will change how you see success forever inside. Natalie Winters checked her watch for the third time, her fingers drumming against the stem of an untouched wineglass. The attorney had perfected the art of appearing composed while feeling anything but. Her auburn hair fell in professional waves past her shoulders, her charcoal suit and silk blouse speaking of courtroom victories and carefully maintained control. At 35, she had learned that success was easier than vulnerability, that building cases was safer than building relationships. The blind date had been her colleague's idea, a persistent suggestion that maybe it was finally time to try again after the betrayal that had shattered her world. Dominic finally pushed through the door, apologizing before he even reached the table. He had been a software architect once, before his wife Rebecca died in a car accident 3 years ago on Christmas Eve. Now he fixed computers and installed networks, work that allowed him to be home when Violet needed him, to walk her to school, to be present in every moment, because he knew too well how quickly moments could end. The corporate world felt hollow after loss, its ambitions meaningless compared to his daughter's laughter. Violet sat in the restaurant's family corner, ostensibly coloring at a small table with crayons and paper, but her hazel eyes missed nothing. She clutched her stuffed rabbit named Clover, a final gift from her mother, and watched her father fumble through small talk with the pretty woman who seemed both elegant and sad. The 7-year-old possessed the kind of clarity that came from experiencing sorrow too young. She understood the shadow that passed over her father's face during holiday songs, recognized the way he held his coffee mug tighter when neighbors mentioned family traditions. The conversation at the main table stumbled through safe territory. Dominic mentioned Violet's love of drawing, his recent work installing a security system for a small business. Natalie spoke briefly about a case she had won, her volunteer work at a legal aid clinic, but beneath the pleasantries ran currents of pain they acknowledged. When Dominic reached for the bread basket, his sleeve caught his water glass, sending liquid cascading across the white tablecloth. His face flushed with embarrassment, and Natalie offered a tight smile while helping to mop up the spill with cloth napkins. What neither adult noticed was Violet sliding from her chair, moving closer to their table with the focused intensity of a child on a mission. She positioned herself behind a decorative evergreen arrangement, studying Natalie with the seriousness of someone reading an important story. The little girl noticed how Natalie's hand kept returning to a simple silver bracelet at her wrist, how her eyes went distant when Dominic mentioned holiday traditions, how she seemed to be working very hard to appear unaffected by something that was clearly affecting her deeply. Natalie's bracelet had belonged to her younger sister Olivia, who died in a hiking accident 7 years earlier. The two sisters had been inseparable, and losing Olivia had carved a hole in Natalie's world that professional achievement could never fill. Then, 3 years ago, her engagement had imploded when she discovered her fiancé had been having an affair with her supposed best friend. The double betrayal had convinced her that emotional investment was simply too costly, that independence was the only reliable path forward. Dominic was speaking about Rebecca's love of art, how she had encouraged Violet's drawing. When he noticed the sudden moisture in Natalie's eyes before she blinked it away, he wanted to reach out, wanted to acknowledge the grief he recognized because it mirrored his own, but the words stuck in his throat. Before he could find them, Natalie excused herself to the restroom, her spine straight, her steps measured, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her careful composure. Left alone at the table, Dominic dropped his head into his hands. Certain the evening was a disaster. He had promised Violet he would try, had looked into her hopeful eyes that morning and agreed that maybe it was time to open himself to possibility again. But sitting here, feeling the familiar ache of inadequacy, he wondered if he was simply too broken to offer anyone anything beyond his devotion to his daughter. It was then that Violet appeared. Climbing into Natalie's vacant chair with Clover tucked under one arm, Dominic looked up, startled, ready to redirect her back to the children's area. But his daughter's expression stopped him. There was a knowing quality in her gaze that seemed impossibly old for 7 years. "She's sad like you, Papa," Violet said simply, using the name she only employed in moments of seriousness. "I can see it on her. The same shadow you get when you think I'm not looking." She reached across the table and patted her father's hand with small fingers. "She needs someone to understand, just like you do." Dominic felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight grip he had maintained on his heart for 3 years. He was about to respond when Natalie returned to the table, her makeup carefully reapplied, her professional mask firmly in place. She stopped short at finding Violet in her seat, the little girl looking up at her with those discerning hazel eyes. "Your bracelet is beautiful," Violet said gently. "Did someone special give it to you?" "My mama gave me Clover before she went to heaven. I wear her love on me, too." Natalie's breath caught audibly. She looked at this small girl, truly looked, and saw reflected in young eyes the same hollow ache she carried. Her carefully constructed composure cracked, just slightly, just enough. "My sister," Natalie whispered, lowering herself into the chair beside Violet rather than across from her. "She was my best friend. I wear her memory close to my heart." "Then you understand," Violet said with the profound simplicity of childhood wisdom, "about missing someone so much it hurts to breathe sometimes. Papa knows too. Maybe that's why you're here together." Dominic watched this exchange, feeling the protective walls he had built beginning to develop fissures. The restaurant's amber lights seemed softer suddenly, the Christmas decorations less painful, the possibility of connection less terrifying. Natalie reached out hesitantly and touched Violet's hand, and the little girl smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had just solved a complex puzzle. Outside, the first serious flakes of what would become a historic blizzard began to fall, though none of them knew it yet. Inside Pine Grove Bistro, 3 people who had each learned to survive alone were taking the first tentative steps towards something neither adults had believed possible anymore: hope. The restaurant's overhead lights flickered once, then twice, drawing nervous glances from diners throughout Pine Grove Bistro. Outside, what had been predicted as a minor snow system was rapidly intensifying into something far more dangerous. The wind picked up with a howl that rattled the tall windows, and the temperature plummeted so quickly that frost began creeping along the glass panes in intricate patterns. Dominic felt the shift in atmosphere immediately, his protective instincts sharpening. He glanced toward the windows where snow was now falling in thick, heavy curtains that obscured the street beyond. The weather forecast that morning had mentioned flurries. Nothing concerning, certainly nothing that would have kept him from attempting this date that Violet had been so excited about. But weather in New England could turn treacherous without warning, and he recognized the signs of a serious storm developing. Natalie noticed his tension, saw how his body had gone alert, how his eyes tracked the worsening conditions outside. She pulled out her phone, checking weather updates, and her expression tightened as she read the emergency alerts scrolling across her screen. The National Weather Service had upgraded the storm to a blizzard warning. Travel was being strongly discouraged. Several highways were already closing due to rapid accumulation and dangerous visibility. "We should probably start thinking about leaving," Dominic said quietly, though he was calculating distances and timing in his head. Their apartment was a 40-minute walk in good conditions. With Violet in a blizzard, that journey could become dangerous quickly. The buses had likely stopped running, and ride services would be overwhelmed or suspended entirely before either adult could formulate a plan. Violet had slipped away from the table, drawn like a magnet to the restaurant's front windows. She had never seen snow fall with such intensity, had never watched it pile against glass in drifts that seemed to climb higher with each passing moment. The world beyond the window was transforming into something magical and otherworldly, a swirling white wonderland that called to her sense of wonder. Without thinking, entranced by the beauty of nature's fury, Violet pushed open the heavy front door and stepped outside. The cold slammed into her like a physical wall, stealing the breath from her small lungs. The snow was already knee-deep, and she stumbled forward, her boots immediately filling with icy powder. She wanted to turn back, to call for her father, but the door had swung shut behind her, and the wind was so loud it swallowed her voice completely. Inside, Dominic turned to reach for Violet's hand, to begin the process of bundling her up for whatever journey lay ahead, and found only empty space where his daughter had been sitting. His heart stopped. The world narrowed to a single, terrible realization. He spun in his seat, scanning the restaurant with rising panic, and then his eyes landed on the front door, slightly ajar, snow blowing through the gap. Violet. The name tore from his throat as a roar that silenced the entire restaurant. He was moving before conscious thought caught up, his body propelled by the primal terror that had haunted his nightmares for 3 years. This was his worst fear made manifest, the thing that woke him gasping at 3 in the morning, the possibility that he would lose his daughter the way he had lost his wife. Natalie reacted on pure instinct. She saw the raw fear in Dominic's face, understood immediately what had happened, and was on her feet and following him before making any conscious decision to do so. They burst through the front door together into a world that had become hostile and alien. The wind cut through their clothing like knives made of ice. The snow was so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet. The street, the buildings, everything familiar had been erased by white chaos. Violet. Dominic's voice cracked with desperation as he called his daughter's name. He stumbled forward into the storm, his eyes scanning frantically, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. This could not be happening. He could not lose her. She was everything, his entire reason for continuing. His light in a world that had gone dark 3 years ago. Natalie cupped her hands around her mouth and added her voice to his, calling for the little girl she had known for barely an hour, but who had somehow already worked her way past defenses Natalie had spent years constructing. The attorney's expensive wool coat was utterly inadequate for a blizzard, her leather boots slipping on ice with every step. But she did not hesitate. She moved alongside Dominic, checking behind parked cars, between storefronts, anywhere a small child might have wandered or taken shelter. They searched for what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, each second stretching into eternity. Dominic's hands shook as he swept snow away from potential hiding spots, his breath coming in ragged gasps that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with terror, so profound it threatened to break him. He was reliving Rebecca's accident, feeling the same helplessness, the same crushing weight of failure. It was Natalie who spotted the small figure huddled against a vehicle in the restaurant's parking area, a tiny form nearly buried in white, only visible because of the pink of Violet's jacket showing through the accumulating snow. She pointed, shouting to be heard over the wind, and Dominic was already running, his boots slipping on black ice, his body crashing to his knees beside his daughter. Violet was crying, her face red and raw with cold, her teeth chattering so violently she could not form words. Her small hands were white, her lips beginning to show a dangerous blue tint. Dominic pulled her into his arms with a sob that came from somewhere deep and broken, wrapping his jacket around her, using his own body to shield her from the wind's assault. His tears froze on his cheeks as he held her, whispering her name over and over like a prayer of gratitude. Natalie arrived seconds later, and without hesitation, she removed her own scarf and wrapped it around Violet's head and shoulders, then pressed herself against Dominic's back, adding her body as another barrier against the storm. The three of them huddled there in the parking lot, strangers hours ago, now locked together in a fight for warmth and survival. Natalie could feel Dominic trembling, could hear the broken quality of his breathing, and she held on tighter, willing her warmth into both father and daughter. "We need to get back inside," Natalie said, her lips nearly numb, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "We cannot stay out here." Together, they struggled to their feet, Dominic carrying Violet, Natalie guiding them back toward the amber glow of the restaurant. They stumbled through the door and nearly collapsed in the entrance, snow sliding off them in chunks, water immediately pooling on the floor beneath them. Other patrons rushed forward with blankets, with towels, with offers of hot drinks and concerned questions. The restaurant manager, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying temples, raised his hands to quiet the anxious crowd. He announced that the city had declared a state of emergency, that all travel was now prohibited, that streets were impassable and transit had shut down completely. Pine Grove Bistro would serve as an emergency shelter for the duration of the storm. No one would be leaving tonight. Dominic sat in a corner booth, Violet wrapped in 3 blankets, her small body still trembling despite the warmth of the restaurant. He rubbed her arms, her back, whispered reassurances, while his own heart continued its frantic rhythm. He could not stop touching her, could not stop verifying that she was truly safe, that he had not lost her. The fear had dredged up every memory of the night Rebecca died, every detail of that phone call, every moment of helpless anguish. Natalie slid into the booth beside them, her hair plastered to her head, her expensive silk blouse ruined, her hands shaking from more than cold. She reached out and placed one hand on Violet's knee, a gesture that felt both natural and terrifying in its intimacy. She had spent years keeping the world at a careful distance, had perfected the art of professional detachment, and yet here she was, emotionally invested in the well-being of a child and father she had met only hours ago. "You were incredibly brave," Natalie told Violet softly, her voice still and steady. "Braver than I have been in a very long time." Violet looked up at her with eyes that were clearing, the panic fading as warmth returned to her small body. "You came to find me," she said wonderingly. "Just like Papa. You both came." Something passed between Dominic and Natalie then, an understanding that bypassed language entirely. In the chaos of the storm and the terror of nearly losing a child, the carefully maintained walls they had each constructed began to crumble. Dominic saw not the polished attorney who had seemed so distant during dinner, but a woman who had run into a blizzard for a child she barely knew, who had offered her own warmth without hesitation, who had chosen courage over self-preservation. Natalie saw not the awkward single father who had seemed overwhelmed by the simple act of conversation, but a man whose love for his daughter was so fierce it bordered on sacred, who had faced his worst nightmare with the determination of someone who would move mountains to protect what mattered most. She saw someone who understood loss in the same profound way she did, who knew what it meant to rebuild a life from broken pieces. The restaurant settled into an uneasy vigil as the storm raged outside. Families clustered together at tables, strangers shared booths, and the staff moved through the space offering what comfort they could. Someone found battery-powered lanterns that cast softer, kinder light than the fluorescent overheads. The golden glow transformed Pine Grove Bistro to something timeless, a refuge suspended outside the normal flow of hours and expectations. Dominic could not stop replaying those terrible minutes when Violet had been missing. His hands continued to shake as he held his coffee cup, his breath occasionally catching in his throat. The guilt sat heavy in his chest. He had promised himself after Rebecca's death that he would never let anything happen to Violet, had structured his entire existence around keeping her safe, and tonight he had failed in the most fundamental way. Natalie watched him with something dangerously close to tenderness. She recognized the self-recrimination in his eyes, the way he seemed to fold into himself with each passing minute. She had carried that same weight after Olivia died, had spent months replaying every decision, wondering if she could have changed the outcome. She wanted to tell him it was not his fault, that children were unpredictable, that he had found Violet and brought her back, and that was what truly mattered. But words felt inadequate for the size of his pain. So instead, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. The touch startled them both, unexpected and electric. Dominic looked down at their joined hands, then up at Natalie's face, and found there an echo of his own anguish, a recognition that went deeper than sympathy or pity. "You lost someone at Christmas," he said quietly. It was not a question, but a statement born of shared understanding. Natalie nodded, her throat tight with emotion she rarely allowed herself to feel. "My sister, 7 years ago, and then 3 years ago. My engagement ended the day before what should have been my wedding. I learned that the man I loved had been lying to me 4 months, that my best friend had betrayed me. I decided then that trusting anyone was simply too dangerous." "My wife," Dominic whispered, his voice breaking slightly on the word. "Car accident, 3 years ago on Christmas Eve. She was coming home from buying last-minute gifts. A drunk driver ran a red light." He swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. "I thought maybe tonight, maybe trying to move forward was possible. But I do not know how to do this anymore. I do not know how to be anything other than Violet's father. I do not know how to trust anymore," Natalie confessed, her own tears finally falling. "I'd built my entire life around being someone who does not need anyone, who cannot be hurt again. But then I watched you run into that storm for your daughter, and I thought maybe I have been wrong about what strength actually looks like. Maybe it is not about walls and distance. Maybe it is about having the courage to be vulnerable anyway." Violet, drowsy from warmth and emotional exhaustion, murmured something neither adult caught initially. Natalie leaned closer, brushing hair back from the little girl's forehead. "What did you say, sweetheart? You are not scary anymore," Violet said sleepily, her eyes already closing. "When you smile at Papa, you look like Mama did, like you see something good." Natalie's breath caught, her tears falling faster now. Dominic's hand tightened around hers, and they sat there in the golden lamplight, two broken people beginning to believe that perhaps broken things could still fit together, that perhaps there was room in a damaged heart for new love, without erasing old memories. The storm continued its assault outside, but inside Pine Grove Bistro, something fragile and precious was beginning to take shape. Neither Dominic nor Natalie understood it fully yet, could not name what was happening between them, but they felt it nonetheless. A possibility, a hope, a chance that maybe, against all odds and fears, they could try again. Across the restaurant, near the bar where a handful of patrons had gathered to watch the storm through large windows, a man stood with narrowed eyes and a bitter expression. Trevor Ashford had worked alongside Natalie for 6 years, had asked her to dinner countless times, had been rejected each time with polite but firm professionalism. He had watched her arrive at the bistro tonight, had seen her blind date unfold from his own table in a dark corner, and he had felt rejection sharpen into something uglier when he saw the way she looked at the ordinary working-class man with his second-hand jacket and calloused hands. Trevor was accustomed to getting what he wanted. He was a senior partner at the firm, successful and ambitious, and he had convinced himself that Natalie's rejections were simply a matter of timing, that eventually she would recognize he was the appropriate choice, the suitable companion. But watching her tend to that man's child, seeing her hold his hand with a gentleness she had never shown Trevor, he felt his ego curdle into spite. He approached their table with a smile that never reached his cold blue eyes, 2 cups of coffee in his hands as though offering kindness. "Natalie, I thought you might need this," he said smoothly, setting 1 cup in front of her. Then he turned to Dominic with practiced condescension. "Quite an evening for a first date, though I suppose," Natalie explained, "this was all part of the firm's community outreach initiative." Dominic blinked, confusion clouding his tired features. Community outreach. Trevor widened his eyes in exaggerated surprise. "Oh, she did not mention it. We have been running this program, the firm, pairing attorneys with people from different socio-economic backgrounds, building bridges, you know, very progressive." He clapped Dominic on the shoulder with false camaraderie. "I think it is admirable what you are doing, participating like this. Not everyone would be comfortable being someone's charitable good deed for the holidays." The words landed like physical blows. Dominic's face went very still. his expression shuttering closed, his hand withdrawing from Natalie's as though burned. The warmth that had been building between them froze into something painful and humiliating. Natalie stared at Trevor with dawning horror, understanding immediately what he was doing, what poison he was spreading. "That is not true," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant. "Trevor, that is a complete lie. There is no community outreach program. Stop this immediately." But the damage was already taking root in Dominic's mind. Every insecurity he carried, every reminder that he was no longer the successful engineer he had been, every awareness of the gap between his current life and Natalie's polished professional world, all of it came rushing to the surface. He stood, his movements stiff, his face carefully blank in the way people become when trying to hide devastating hurt. "It is fine," he said quietly, the emptiness in his voice worse than any anger could have been. "I understand. I should have realized. Thank you for helping with Violet. I genuinely appreciate it. Dominic, please." Natalie stood as well, reaching for him, desperation making her voice sharp. "He's lying. There is no program. I agreed to this date because a friend set it up, because I thought maybe I was ready to try meeting someone. That is the truth. It is okay," Dominic repeated, and each word felt like a door closing. He lifted Violet into his arms, blankets and all, and moved to a different booth across the restaurant, his back to Natalie, his shoulders rigid with wounded pride and familiar resignation. He had been a fool to hope, to believe that someone like her could see anything of value in someone like him. Trevor smiled at Natalie's stricken expression, satisfaction evident in his posture. "I was just trying to clarify the situation. No need for misunderstandings to continue. Get away from me," Natalie said, her voice shaking with fury so intense it took all her control to scream. "You are a petty, cruel, vindictive person, and you just hurt someone who has suffered enough. I want nothing to do with you. I hurt someone." Trevor scoffed, his mask of pleasantness dropping away to reveal naked contempt. "You are the one slumming it with the handyman. Natalie, I was doing you a favor, reminding you of who you actually are, where you actually belong. You will thank me eventually. I know exactly who I am," Natalie said coldly, though her hands trembled with emotion. "I am someone who just realized I have wasted years of my life working alongside people like you. Now leave before I make a scene that will haunt your career." Trevor retreated, but the damage was complete. Natalie sank back into her seat, her heart fracturing as she watched Dominic across the room, his body language radiating hurt and withdrawal. She wanted to go to him, to somehow undo what Trevor had poisoned, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. She had seen the look on Dominic's face, the resignation, the familiar expectation of disappointment. He had believed Trevor because some part of him had been waiting for the other shoe to drop. For confirmation that hope was foolish, the night stretched endlessly forward, the storm outside showing no signs of weakening. Natalie sat alone at her table, watching Dominic hold Violet, rocking her gently, his face turned toward the window. She felt the weight of her own walls, the years of self-protection that now felt less like strength and more like cowardice. She had pushed everyone away, had convinced herself that independence was the only reliable path. And now when something real had almost broken through, she was powerless to reach across the gap. But Violet, even in her exhaustion, had been watching, listening, understanding in the way children sometimes do. When her father's arms relaxed slightly as he dozed from emotional exhaustion, the little girl slipped from the booth and padded across the restaurant in her sock feet until she stood before Natalie's table. Clover clutched to her chest. "You made Papa sad," Violet said. There was no accusation in her voice, only observation, only the clear-eyed honesty of someone too young to hide behind pretense. "I did not mean to," Natalie whispered, her voice breaking. The man who said those terrible things, he was lying. He was being cruel because he was jealous. "I did not know tonight was going to be special. I thought it would be another disappointing evening, where I would prove to myself that I was right to stay closed off. But then I met you and I met your father, and everything changed. Violet studied her with those wise hazel eyes that seemed to see straight through to the truth of things. Papa thinks nobody will ever love him again because Mama is gone. He thinks he is too broken, that he is not good enough anymore. She climbed uninvited into the booth beside Natalie, her small hand finding the attorney's larger one. But you are broken too, are you not? I can tell. And you still came to find me in the snow. You still helped even though you were scared. Natalie's tears finally fell, hot and silent on her cold cheeks. I am broken. I have been broken for a very long time. I stopped believing in love, stopped trusting anyone, stopped hoping for anything beyond professional success. Maybe broken people can fix each other, Violet said with the profound simplicity that only children possess. Like when Papa glues my toys back together. Two broken pieces can make one whole thing if you are patient and careful. She leaned against Natalie's side, trusting and warm. I think you are the one for Papa, even if he is too scared to see it right now. Natalie wrapped an arm around the little girl, holding her carefully, as though she were made of something precious and fragile. Across the restaurant, Dominic woke to find Violet gone and sat up in immediate panic before spotting her with Natalie. His first instinct was to retrieve her, to maintain the protective distance that felt safer than vulnerability. But watching his daughter curl against the woman who had run into a blizzard for her, seeing Natalie hold Violet with such tender care, something in Dominic's chest began to crack open. The hours crept toward dawn, the storm finally beginning to lose its ferocity. As the first grey light touched the sky, city snowplows rumbled past, their orange lights flashing through frost-covered windows, and the restaurant manager announced that streets were being cleared, that transit would resume within hours, that the emergency was passing. People began to stir, gathering belongings, checking phones that were finally receiving signals again, making plans to return to their disrupted lives. The night that had seemed endless was coming to a close, and with morning came the necessity of decisions neither Dominic or Natalie felt prepared to make. The grey light of Christmas morning filtered through the restaurant's windows, washing over surfaces that bore the evidence of an unexpected night. Empty coffee cups clustered on tables, blankets lay folded in booths, and the scattered remnants of a makeshift shelter told the story of strangers who had become temporary family in the face of nature's fury. Outside, the world had been transformed into something clean and new, the city buried under 2 feet of pristine snow that sparkled in the weak winter sun. Dominic approached Natalie's table slowly, each step requiring more courage than he would have believed possible. Violet was still asleep against her shoulder, the little girl's face peaceful in a way that made his heart ache. He had spent the remaining hours of night thinking, wrestling with pride and fear, replaying Trevor's words and then, more importantly, replaying everything that had happened before those words. The terror of losing Violet, the way Natalie had run into the storm without hesitation, the recognition he had felt when they shared their grief, the warmth of her hand in his. I should take her, Dominic said quietly, his voice rough from exhaustion and emotion. We should probably start thinking about getting home. Natalie looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed from crying and sleeplessness, her carefully maintained professional appearance completely undone. She had never looked more beautiful to him, more real, more human. Before you do, she said, her voice steady despite the fear making her heart race, I need you to know that what Trevor said was a lie. There is no charity program. I agreed to this date because a colleague set us up, because she thought maybe we would understand each other. That is the complete truth. I want to believe you, Dominic admitted, lowering himself into the booth across from her, careful not to wake Violet. But I spent 3 years believing that what I had with Rebecca was once in a lifetime, that trying for anything else would somehow diminish what we shared. And then last night, for the first time, I felt something that was not grief or duty or simple survival. I felt possibility, and it terrified me more than the storm did. When Trevor said what he said, he continued, his hands clenched on the table. Part of me was almost relieved, because fear is familiar, disappointment is familiar. I know how to live in that space. But hope is dangerous. Hope means risking everything again. I know, Natalie said, and her voice carried the weight of her own years of self-protection. I know exactly what you mean, because I felt it too, that terrifying possibility that maybe I could trust someone again, that maybe you could see past all my defenses and not run away. When you pulled back last night, when you walked away, I wanted to let you go. It would have been easier. It would have proved what I have been telling myself for years, that staying closed off is the smarter choice. She reached across the table, palm up, an offering. But then your daughter reminded me that being brave is not about not being afraid. It is about doing the thing that scares you anyway, about choosing vulnerability, even when every instinct screams to retreat. Dominic looked at her outstretched hand, at her face, and saw reflected there his own desperate longing for connection, his own exhausted hope that maybe broken things could be enough. He placed his hand in hers, their fingers intertwining with a rightness that felt almost inevitable. I do not know what happens next, Natalie continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I do not know if we are too damaged, too scared, too complicated. But I know I do not want to walk away without trying, without at least being honest. I have not felt this much in 3 years, and yes, it hurts. It terrifies me, but it also makes me feel alive for the first time since I convinced myself that being numb was safer than being real. Violet stirred between them, murmuring something that sounded suspiciously like finally, before settling back into sleep. Despite everything, despite the exhaustion and emotion and uncertainty, both adults smiled. The little girl's satisfaction was evident even in her dreams. She knew, Dominic said softly, that first moment at the table, when she said you were the one. I thought she was just being a child, making wishes. But she saw what I was too afraid to acknowledge. Children see clearly, Natalie agreed. They have not learned yet to protect themselves with lies and distance. They just know what they know. The restaurant manager appeared then, announcing that city services had declared main streets passable, that the subway was running on limited schedule, that people could begin making their way home. Around them, patrons stood unstretched, gathered coats and bags, began the process of returning to normal life after an abnormal night. But at their booth, Dominic and Natalie sat for a moment longer, hands clasped, neither quite ready to let go of whatever fragile thing had been built between them. Can I see you again? Dominic finally asked, the words coming out awkward, but utterly sincere. Properly, I mean, without storms or emergencies or interference. Yes, Natalie said, and her smile was the first genuine one he had seen from her, warm and unguarded. I would like that very much. I would like that more than I can adequately express. Violet woke then, stretching like a cat, her hazel eyes blinking open, to find both adults watching her with expressions of tender amusement. She sat up, looking between them, and her grin was pure triumph. You figured it out, she announced with satisfaction. I knew you would. You just needed time. You are a very wise young lady, Natalie told her, her voice thick with emotion. Much wiser than either of us. Can you come to our house for Christmas? Violet asked suddenly, her small hands reaching for Natalie's. We make paper snowflakes. Papa is not very good at it, but I can teach you both. And we have hot chocolate. And we could watch movies, please. Natalie looked at Dominic, a question in her eyes. He nodded, something warm and fragile blooming in his chest. We would be honored to have you, he said. If you do not have other plans, I had plans to work through case files and pretend today was just another day, Natalie admitted. Coming to your home sounds infinitely better. They departed Pine Grove Bistro together into a city transformed. The snow was pristine and blinding in the morning sun, piled high against buildings and cars, making familiar streets look like scenes from a winter fairy tale. Children were already emerging to play, their laughter carrying on the cold air, and somewhere nearby church bells rang to celebrate the holiday. The 3 days that followed were careful and precious. Dominic and Natalie texted frequently, their conversations starting surface level, but gradually deepening as they learned to trust this tentative connection. They spoke on the phone late at night, when Violet was asleep, voices hushed in the darkness. sharing pieces of themselves they had kept hidden. Natalie learned that Dominic sang off key to classic rock while cooking, that he kept a photograph of Rebecca in his wallet, not out of inability to move forward, but as a promise never to forget the love that had shaped him. She learned that he was patient and kind, that he noticed small details, that he laughed easily once his guard came down. Part 2 is coming soon.